Om Sri Ramakrishnaaya Namaha. Salutations to Sri Ramakrishna. Namaste Pravrajika Shuddhatma Pranaji and to everyone else. Today's topic is Bhakti and Jnana. Oh, I was told to introduce myself. I've been here for a while, I guess. Most of you know me, but those who don't know, I was at Brown as a graduate student, and then I joined a local company here, and I mostly sit upstairs, somewhat managing a sound system. So that's my introduction. I think that should be enough. So the title is Bhakti and Jnana. Most of you probably know the meanings of these words, but just to bring some clarity, I will present the definitions. These two words can be used either as a goal or a path that leads to the goal. So when we treat them as goals, Bhakti means devotion, and Jnana means knowledge. But when we use them as means to reach the goals, Bhakti can represent a set of devotional practices, and Jnana would be a reasoning or analytical thinking that leads to the goal. We may be thinking that the goals are different, but actually the goals are the same, but the paths that lead to the goal are different, of course. So when we say a saint is a Jnani or a Bhakta, what we mean is following that certain path of Jnana or Bhakti. And if he has reached the goal, of course, the goal is the same thing that he has reached, what other people would have followed in different paths. And today's focus will be mostly on Bhakti. Jnana will be acting as an auxiliary in the talk that I will present. Attempts have been made to classify the spiritual practices into various categories, and these categories are called yogas. One example is Bhagavad Gita, where all the 18 chapters have been titled as a yoga based on the particular technique that's been described in that chapter. Swami Vivekananda in modern times classified them into 4 categories. Before I go there, actually, I want to define yoga. Yoga means just communion, and for us, it could mean communion with God. Specifically. And these 4 yogas that he classified were based on the particular faculty of mind that's used in practicing that yoga. So for example, Jnana Yoga would be a reasoning faculty that's employed, Raja Yoga would be concentration, Karma Yoga would be the tendency to work, and Bhakti Yoga would be emotions. So when we say Bhakti Yoga, what we mean is communion with God through emotions, or using emotions properly. I would say that Bhakti Yoga is the most universal yoga, mainly because one may have an aptitude I think I'm running ahead, sorry. One may have an aptitude, or may not have an aptitude for reasoning, concentration, or tendency to work, but everyone wants to be loved and to love someone. So it's somewhat inherent in a human being. So that makes Bhakti Yoga somewhat universal compared to other yogas. Besides that, it's also very practical in the modern times. That's what Sri Ramakrishna says. I'll quote, "The path of karma is very difficult. First of all, as I have just said, where will one find time for it nowadays? Where is the time for a man to perform his duties as enjoined in the scriptures? Man's life is short in this age. Further, it is extremely difficult to perform one's duties in a spirit of detachment without craving the result. One cannot work in such a spirit without first having realized God. Attachment to the result somehow enters the mind, though you may not be aware of it. To follow Jnana Yoga in this age also is very difficult. First, a man's life depends entirely on food. Second, he has a short span of life. Third, he can by no means get rid of body consciousness, and the knowledge of Brahman is impossible without the destruction of body consciousness. The Jnani says, I am Brahman, I am not the body. I am beyond hunger and thirst, disease and grief, birth and death, pleasure and pain. How can you be a Jnani if you are conscious of disease, grief, pain, pleasure, and the like? A thorn enters your flesh, blood flows from the wound, and you suffer very badly from the pain. But nevertheless, if you are a Jnani, you must be able to say, why? There is no thorn in my flesh at all. Nothing is the matter with me. Therefore, Bhakti Yoga is prescribed for this age. By following this path, one comes to God more easily than by following the others. I can somewhat vouch for this teaching because whenever I go to an amusement park, the roller coaster ride scares me a lot. So all these ideas of I am the Atman, I am beyond death, they just go out of the window. So I would say probably most of us are naturally inclined to Bhakti Yoga in that matter, because whenever we find some difficulties, we have this tendency to get some solace, confidence, and comfort from some external being who is superior to us. Unlike in Jnana, where you're all by yourself. And also there's this idea, how often do we really think that I would like to do some Bhakti Yoga now or Jnana Yoga now? We really don't think on those lines. What we do is we try to do our normal activities and we try to employ these techniques of yoga in those activities. So the focus is that to do those normal activities in a technical way rather than employ or rather than use the technique itself. Suppose I offer you a choice of choosing one ice cream amongst the three flavors, say chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry. Probably you can choose one in a second or so. In the same way, if I offer you three flavors of or four flavors of coffee here, mocha, espresso, latte, cappuccino, you will choose one in a jiffy. But somehow, when it comes to the four yogas, we are somewhat confused. I would say, most of us maybe. We are not sure which one would really appeal to us. We probably do a little bit of everything, but we never really gave a serious thought which particular yoga would be something like our cornerstone of our spiritual practice. I would suggest that we should actually think on those lines, because that's what will make us go deeper into yoga and realize God. Swami Vivekananda says in that respect, take up one idea, make that one idea your life, dream of it, think of it, live on that idea. Let the brain, the body, muscles, nerves, every part of your body be full of that idea, and just leave every other idea alone. This is the way to success, and this is the way great spiritual giants are produced. For example, if you see life of Sri Ramana Maharshi or Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we call them, say, Ramana Maharshi as Jnani and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as a Bhakta, devotee. So we see that the practices were very intense in that particular yoga. So maybe we will not be able to do this at this stage, but eventually we have to strive to attain that kind of stability in doing one particular yoga continuously. So, and also we have heard that all these yogas have to be synthesized and also harmonized in our daily practices. So again, as I said earlier, maybe initially we have to employ all four of them together, and this is somewhat like a parallel to the four wheels of a car to give stability to our devotion or spiritual journey. But when that's necessary in the beginning stages, because our mind cannot use one faculty continuously for long at that stage. So using all four yogas is appropriate and should be done. But once we have some kind of stability and want to dive deeper, we should choose one particular yoga as our cornerstone of a spiritual practice. When I say the word choose, it doesn't mean necessarily what you like, because things may not be the same as appropriate for you, whatever you like. You should also consider, of course, if you have a teacher, that's obviously appropriate, but you should also consider things like what is your daily routine, because some of your activities have to be aligned with that particular yoga too. And also what station in life you are, whether you are elderly or young person or whatever, whether you have children to take care of and so on. So anyway, you have to make a suitable choice based on the overall factors that are affecting our daily routines. Once that stability of mind has attained and you make a particular choice of a yoga, and you dive deep into it, the life will be somewhat like a unicycle, where the only one wheel is representing your yoga that you have doing it intensely, and other yogas would rather be not part of the vehicle itself, but actually they would form the hedges on the spiritual road, which will protect the aspirant from going astray. So to conclude, as novices, we might have to do all four yogas where synthesis and harmony both are equally emphasized. And as experts, or maybe in advanced stages, we have to do one particular yoga with other yogas acting as auxiliaries. And here, probably the harmony of yogas is more emphasized than the synthesis itself. I remember a quote from my friend in college days. He said, "I'm sick of this mediocrity." what he meant was he was unable to excel in sports, academics, arts, or whatever. I would think when he said that, I would think, well, I would belong to the same category, of course. But besides that, even in spirituality, I would belong to the same category. So that's what we should make enough efforts to get out of that so-called mediocrity. We also apply synthesis of yogas in probably normally, but we also do it sometimes in a disingenuous way, something leading to harmful way rather. So we use what tenets of one path to destroy the progress being done in another path. For example, when we worship the image of God, say Vishnu or someone, we should not see the image something as made of wood or metal or whatever, stone. We should try to inculcate a living presence of the deity on the image. So that's where we can develop love for God. If we just treat it as a regular image, there's no point in doing a ritual anyway, because we are not getting much out of that. Here, for example, in the shrine, Sri Ramakrishna's image must be treated, I would say, as though Sri Ramakrishna were really there. So that way we can tune our thoughts, words, and deeds, at least in the shrine here, and we carry over the same attitude elsewhere too, and that way we get proper training and probably develop love for God too. The best example I think of is Swami Ramakrishnananda, who was in Madras and disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. He, at one night, it was raining very heavily in the ashram, and there was water leaking in the shrine, and the water was dripping onto the image of Sri Ramakrishna. Probably a practical person would do just is take the image and move it somewhere. But Swami Ramakrishnananda stood there with an umbrella over the image, protecting it, because he didn't want to disturb the sleep of Sri Ramakrishna. He felt Sri Ramakrishna very intensely in that image. So that's what we should also strive for if you want to follow the path of bhakti. At the same time, so now on the other side, if someone is following the path of jnana, probably they have to get over all these images. So that means you really don't consider any personal God. You don't have any images to do with. This is a bit difficult for most of us, I guess, but that's what it is if someone wants to seriously follow that. So we must be very careful and cautious in choosing what practices we do and how we do it, because making sometimes a hodgepodge of this and that will probably lead us nowhere. So a careful blending of emotions and analytical reasoning will give us much impetus in our spiritual growth. It will make a devotee less fanatic and much more, of course, less fanatic and also less emotional or sentimental. But at the same time, it also makes the jnani not a cold-hearted brute, thinking that everything, all the suffering in this world is unreal. I don't have to do anything with it. So what we have to do is we have to carefully blend both these faculties to such that we don't harm the progress that we are doing in one path, but at the same time we also give an impetus to progress faster. So what's the goal of the yogas? Goal of the yogas is, of course, to reach God or self or reality, whatever you call. There are three conceptualizations of God in general across all the religions. When I say conceptualization, I don't mean it to be like some kind of a theoretical concept. It is something of an actual perception of the spiritual aspirant. So it's a very real entity in that sense. The first one is a personal God with qualities without form. The other one is personal God with qualities and with form. Now this with form could be either an anthropomorphic or not. And if it's an anthropomorphic, again, it could be a living person who lived in some time in the past, say an incarnation or a prophet. Or it could be an image like Vishnu, Shiva, etc. And the other aspect is, of course, the impersonal God with no qualities and formless. Bhakti, by and large, has to deal with the personal God. That is the first two conceptualizations. And when it gets matured, it may get transformed to the impersonal God, but the underlying language it gets expressed in is always of that of a personal God. It's an outside-in approach. By that I mean, in the initial stages, the devotee sees the personal God as something external, not very close to the devotees or a person's heart as such. But this, as one matures or evolves, this personal God is brought closer to the devotee, and eventually the devotee and God become one. That's the goal of bhakti. As opposed to this, jnana deals mostly with the impersonal God. The language, at least expressed, is more of an impersonal God. And the practitioner here also perceives the impersonal God as a personal God when traversing the path. But he or she denies this personal God rather than worshipping or revering or loving what a bhakta or a devotee does. So it's more of a negative approach, whereas bhakti involves more of a positive approach. Again, it's an inside-out approach. By this, I mean the individual entity that is felt within is analyzed, reasoned out, and thought of, and after careful analysis, it's concluded that this individual entity is all-pervading, is transcendent and immanent. So finally, that means both the bhakti and jnana eventually reach the same goal, but the approaches are different. Probably most of us do a mix of both of these approaches. So we probably solve the problem from both sides, like we do in mathematics sometimes. So the rest of my talk would mostly deal with bhakti yoga and less of jnana yoga, with jnana yoga acting only as a support or an auxiliary. Before I go further, actually, I used to have this internal tussle, or maybe you still have, between bhakti and jnana, because both are appealing at some point of time, based on your mood, probably. So, as a child, when I grew up, I was very much interested all this in rituals, images, stories, and worships, of course, because they gave good food too. That's one of the reasons. But besides that, then as I grew up, I lost some kind of interest. Then, of course, when you get exposed to jnana, it immediately connected to my intellect. One thing because I was more trained in physical sciences, we start thinking of reasoning faculty as somewhat superior to emotional faculty. At least that's what I used to think. I think probably many people think on those lines too. So obviously, when we come to this spiritual world, we obviously think, oh, well, bhakti is all about emotions, so maybe it's not so, it's somewhat low. It's not for me at least. I'm somewhat superior or good. But lately I realized, first of all, I gave a good example that I'm nowhere there. Whenever I go to an amusement park, it reminds me that I'm not there yet. Besides that, I lately realized that at least they both lead to the same goal. It's only that they are different approaches, and people may choose according to their temperament, whatever they want to do. One of the early poems that influenced me was Bhaja Govindam by Sri Adi Shankaracharya. In that poem, it is a nice blend of bhakti and jnana, where Shankaracharya says, he cultivates a dispassion for the reader because he expresses everything that's impermanent. But at the same time, he also brings the point that we need to cultivate devotion to Govinda. He uses the word Govinda there. You can say God in general. So that was a very good poem that I got influenced, at least in my initial stages, probably even now too. So going ahead, I need to drink some water, sorry, my mouth is getting too dry. Let us see what kind of training we need to get in devotion. As I said, I'll focus mostly on devotion in this talk for the rest of my talk. First is the mental component, which is more like what kind of moods that you need to cultivate to relate to God, to intensify the love for God. And the next other component would be the physical one, where you use these moods to put them into practice so that love for God can be intensified. So let us see the first one, the mental training. The question will be, of course, how to love a personal God. First of all, it's easy to love a human being, say even animals, or even inanimate objects like gadgets, cars, homes, etc. But we haven't really, at least I would assume, most of us haven't really perceived any personal God with our physical senses itself. We may visualize, imagine, but that's about it. So how do you really generate love for such an entity whom we haven't perceived through our senses? So the method prescribed here is how we love human beings in the same way we probably translate that procedure to loving God also. So let us analyze a little bit more carefully how we love human beings in our life. So I just picked up kind of a life from infancy to old age, and what kind of people we interact with and how we love them, or whom we love them, rather. So the first one is, as an infant, most of us obviously love mother because she takes care of us. And as a child, you probably, after a few years, you add father and siblings to that list. And then as youth, maybe friends also get added to that. And as an adult, partner gets added to this list. What I underlined is more like stating that this is the primary person whom we love most. So maybe as an adult, most of us probably love partner more than other people. That's an assumption, of course, but it's by and large true, I guess. Again, as parent, probably children take over, with other people taking lower steps in the hierarchy of our loving, the intensity of love that we have. And as grandparent, it's usual to have grandchildren as the main focus, with other people taking lower steps, I would say. So a person's life, which began as an infant, loving mother intensely, changes to grandchildren at the end of the life. What we have seen is a series of replacement of people in our lives to whom intensity of love was directed. But whatever be the case, all these loves were developed only through one, that is association. The more you try to associate with the person, there is more likelihood of cultivating that love towards the person. So in the same way, we have to see whether we can carry over such kind of a process and emotional moods that we have experienced in the human life towards God also. So we use these powerful emotional moods towards God by developing some kind of relationship with God, just as we have done in a human life or in a regular human living. But this will be done, of course, in a devotional way there. And once we have developed such kind of a mood or a relationship, we actually put that into practice through some set of devotional practices. We'll talk about this later on in the talk. So the first mood is Shanta Bhava. We have actually heard these devotional moods from Swami Yogatmanji a few weeks ago on Bhakti Yoga class, and I think even Pravajika Shuddhatma Pranaji also described that in the Tuesday class just a few days ago. So anyway, it may be a bit of repetition for some, but we'll go ahead. The devotional mood, first one is Shanta Bhava. Here, God is seen as a transcendental being, evoking no effervescent emotions. It is, although there may be strong, intense emotions, but there's no external expression to it. This is somewhat similar to a father's love for a child. That's what at least I think, because father is usually not so expressive, unlike a mother. Valmiki's love for Sri Rama would fall somewhat in this category. The next one is the devotional mood 2, which is the Dasya Bhava, where God is seen as a master and devotee would treat himself or herself as a servant. And here love is generated through offering service to the deity, the God. One may ask a question, what need is there? What does God need to be served? It's actually not the God that really needs to be served. It's more for us. We actually impose a need on God and go on to fulfill that need, just so that we get an opportunity to create that loving relationship with God. Here the devotee feels there is no individual will for oneself, it's all master's will, and master's happiness is of only concern for the devotee here. Sri Hanuman's love for Rama is of this category. Sri Ramakrishna also practiced this emotional mood, or devotional mood rather, bhava, when he treated Sri Rama as his master, and so he went into the mood of Sri Hanuman. And in Islam, we keep hearing this word inshallah very common. So they actually use this very often, I would say. That's what at least I heard. So the idea that God willing is so ingrained in their culture. It's actually, I feel very impressed by that sometimes, that they really use it almost in every sentence, whether it be good or bad. Devotional mood 3 is Sakya Bhava. This is a mood where God is treated as a friend. I would say this is by and large the most universal mood applicable to most of us, because we may or may not have Sakya Bhava, that is, this is Sakya Bhava, Shanta Bhava, or we may or may not have the early one, Dasya Bhava, servant attitude, or we may not have the following ones, which are like Vatsalya Bhava, that is a child, love for a child, and Madhura Bhava, love for a partner. But I think by and large, everyone has a friend, I would say so. And so this is the most universal of all. So that way, it's probably easily applicable for us to treat God as a friend. In this mood, of course, the devotee shares all the thoughts and ideas with God, because he's seeing God as somewhat an equal. Just like we treat friends as equal, we share everything. So whenever we have to see God in our human friends too. So whenever we receive help from them or we help them, it's like as though we are helping God in them or we are getting help from God. That's the practice that we have to do in our daily routines. Arjuna's love for Sri Krishna was of this temperament. And the fourth devotional mood is Vatsalya Bhava. Here God is seen as a child who needs to be taken care of. Again, this is probably one of the most intense feelings that people have in their lives, love for children. It's common to see Sri Krishna, Jesus Christ, as infants to be loved. That's a very common practice. And Sri Ramakrishna also practiced it with an image of child Rama, which he really offered loving service to that deity in the form of child Rama. Also, there's a practice in India where children are dressed as Sri Krishna when they are very, a toddler or maybe 4 or 5 years of age. So the women folk worship that child Krishna, or actually the child, but who is in the form of Krishna. They invoke the feelings of Krishna within themselves. Sri Ramakrishna was worshipped that way when he was a child by the women folk of his village. The devotional mood 5 is the Madhura Bhava. Here, God is seen as a husband, and devotee is treats himself or herself as a beloved. This is probably the most intimate of all human relationships, because people share all kinds of thoughts and ideas with a partner, which they may not do with other people. And also, this is one of the most, I would say, well-planned, carefully nurtured, thought of relationship, at least in the humankind, because when two partners initially, they actually have to put a lot of efforts to, develop that kind of love for each other. They, go somewhere, plan, make trips, meet, talk to each other for a long time, go on a cruise, spend some expensive gifts, and so on. It's basically a well-planned, thought of love. So I would say we should probably translate that similar planning that we put in that human love to the love for God also. So the same focus, efforts, time, and sacrifices that we make in nurturing that kind of human relationship, we should probably employ it in God too. There, at the cost of everyone else, people like to be with the human partners. So probably we should do the same thing with God too. At the cost of every human relationship, we should just be with God. That's as far as we can. Probably should try our best to do that. Various examples are there, of course, and again, Sri Ramakrishna himself practiced this, and there are Sufi saints like Shamsuddin Hafiz and Rumi. There are also Christian saints like Saint John of Cross. There's a Song of the Songs in Old Testament, Gopis in Vrindavan. There are Hindu sages like Mirabai Andal, Akka Mahadevi. And in Catholic nuns also, they treat God as their beloved. Here I'd like to give a quote from Swami Vivekananda. Often it so happens that divine lovers who sing of this divine love accept the language of human love in all its aspects as adequate to describe it. Fools do not understand this. They never will. They look at it only with the physical eye. They do not understand the mad throes of this spiritual love. How can they? For one kiss of thy lips, O beloved, one who has been kissed by thee, has his thirst for thee increasing forever. All his sorrows vanish, and he forgets all things except thee alone. Aspire after that kiss of the beloved, that touch of his lips which makes the bhakta mad, which makes of man a god. To him who has been blessed with such a kiss, the whole of nature changes, worlds vanish, suns and moons die out, and the universe itself melts away into that one infinite ocean of love. That is the perfection of the madness of love. We may not have one particular mood. It probably, if you see the whole life, although again there have been examples of that kind too, but at least in initial stages, just like in yogas, maybe we'll have a little bit of all these moods. Maybe we can, at least that's what I think is, as the human relationships we had, as we proceed in our life, we had different human relationships, and so the particular emotions are intense at that particular stage of life. Maybe we can direct those kind of those very emotions in that stage of life towards God. So as a child, maybe we can begin with Sakhya Bhava, which is God as a friend. Then as an adult, maybe we can try to inculcate the Madhura Bhava, that is God as a partner. And as a parent, maybe we can inculcate the Vatsalya Bhava, God as a child. But of course, this is just an example that I'm giving, but people might have different methodologies to use them. So we have seen the mental training that we need, that is the emotional moods that we want to cultivate to connect with God. But in the same way, now we have to see what kind of physical practices that we need to do using these moods so that we can intensify the love for God. Just as we have seen earlier, personal God is not perceived by senses. So we need to somehow, obviously, have some entity. And here the primary methodology prescribed is a visualization through imagination. So that's the main methodology in training ourselves to be devoted first, because we have to visualize the personal God. Of course, if someone is devoted to an incarnation or a prophet, that's a different thing, because we have some evidence for that. But if you are thinking of, say, Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, those images we need to have some kind of strong visualization. Even with incarnations, it's not like the imagination is strong enough. We may have a picture or whatever, but it doesn't mean it's so very intense and lively in our perception. So one may ask, well, it's only an imagination after all. It's not real thing. That's the idea. At least I used to have too. So here comes an unlikely source who can help us. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we now know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. He might have said this in the context of scientific research, but it is very much applicable to even spiritual field too. Today's imagination would be actually tomorrow's realization. I probably heard this somewhere. It's not, I may make it up here, but anyway, so going ahead, there are various techniques that have been described in many devotional scriptures, say Narada Bhakti Sutras, Adhyatma Ramayana, Srimad Bhagavatam, Ramcharitamanas. But the simplest that I found, and somewhat easy to implement rather, is from Sri Ramakrishna. This is the quote. The other day I told you the meaning of bhakti. It is to adore God with body, mind, and words. With body means to serve and worship God with one's hands, go to holy places with one's feet, hear the chanting of the name and glories of God with one's ears, and behold the divine image with one's eyes. With mind means to contemplate and meditate on God constantly, and to remember and think of his Leela. Leela means here deeds, God's deeds. With words means to sing hymns to him and chant his name and glories. So I kind of put some of my own summary, I would say, of practices that we can do in training ourselves to inculcate that devotion, based on the quote from Sri Ramakrishna earlier presented, and also elsewhere that he talked about in Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and also from those devotional texts that I mentioned before. So the first one I came up with was a worship. We have some of these rules of worship which are very strict, and probably most of us maybe not even liking it, but that's necessarily to be followed, because that's how we have to feel the living presence of the deity. If that's the goal, the following these rules will make us conscious every time when we follow that there is a real person there whom I'm serving. Otherwise, ritual would be just like a ritual, with just some physical actions. it has to go with the mental component. And when we invite a guest to our house, it's usually we follow the decorum, everything properly. So it must be the same when we do worship too. And Sri Ramakrishna himself worshipped Divine Mother for a long time, and of course we all revere him and so on. So it would be very foolhardy for us to dismiss worship as something as a mere ritual. With the worships that we do here, the background is that the deity who is seated in the heart of the devotee, or the worshipper rather, is brought out, and then we offer our loving service to that deity, and then again he or she, the deity, is brought back into the heart of the devotee. This is symbolically done as immersion of images in Ganesh and Durga Puja festivals too. The second practice is the pilgrimage, fasting, and other penances. This is mainly to rejuvenate one's spiritual fervor. Sometimes, change of place or even these holy places that have that very strong vibrations help us to rejuvenate our spiritual fervor. And also recalling the pilgrimage in the comforts of our home later helps us to meditate properly, also gives us a spiritual urge. And again, it's a good opportunity to learn from the devotees that you meet during the pilgrimages. Very often we really see a lot of devotees there, and talking to them, interacting with them, we definitely learn a lot. And also the hardships that you face in pilgrimages and fasting and other penances teach us, because with the focus being on God during those practices, we overcome those hardships very easily. So this attitude can be translated to a daily routine also. So whenever you face hardships, if your focus is on God, you would probably easily get over those difficulties. The practice number 3 is a holy company. This is probably, most of the human beings do require a company, some human being. And for a devotee, of course, the utmost would be to get a holy company. This is the primary practice for a devotee. And Sri Ramakrishna has told numerous times in Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna also that devotee has to have a holy company. This is the most important aspect. It removes the attachments in our life, because we begin to learn from the company that we have, the holy company. And definitely company influences a lot a person's thoughts and actions and so on. So all the attachments that we have for material objects or even human relations may drop off if we try to be in the holy company. The spiritual hunger that's in us can only be understood by holy company, not by one's family or friends. They may not appreciate it much. So we definitely need some kind of support, I would say, as a community to have some holy company. That's very important. And also the other important aspect is, if you are in a holy company, it's easy to ensure a discipline, because being alone and individualistic, unless you are you have very strong will and you are totally up there, it's very hard. Most of us probably may need some holy company, because whenever we are not motivated to do spiritual practices, it's the holy company that will spur us to do those practices. Practice number 4 is devotional songs. This is more of a nourishment of our emotional faculty. The songs that are put to music, especially bhajans and kirtans, they enter deep into the heart. And a devotee really gets carried away with them to some kind of realm which is, you can say, blissful. And the songs themselves have these words which convey the pathos, the bliss, the divine glories and deeds, everything in them. So it's nice for meditation when we actually get along with the song. Practice 5 is reading scriptures and listening to discourses. This is more of a nourishment for our analytical or reasonal faculty. And also this will serve as information for our meditation practices that will follow after this. So whatever information that you gain from these scriptures and listening to discourses, they can be meditated upon. But I want to put a caution here. We need to be careful in what we read or listen to. Because, for example, here in Vedanta society, most of the impetus is always towards the impersonal God aspect. We do have personal God also. I mean, not we, I meant we do get presented that kind of emphasis too. But I would say it's more of a aspect of anthropomorphic with the incarnation aspect, if you recall the classification that I presented earlier. Anthropomorphic with the incarnation as the main focus. If we have, say, a deity like Vishnu or Shiva, what we present usually is that it's a symbolic representation of the impersonal God. Now, if someone is very devoted to, say, Vishnu, Shiva, it's very hard to comprehend that, because you want to feel these images to be realistic. These are the images that are living and lively. So when we say it's a symbolic representation, it kind of takes away that factor. So I would say a devotee who is very much interested in following, say, Vishnu or Shiva, it'd be hard for them, say, maybe here, I don't know, but this is at least my personal opinion. But it'll be hard for them if they follow that kind of a literature for quite long, at least initially. It may be a different matter that once the person has some kind of maturity, that he may evolve out of that and may really see Vishnu and Shiva as the representation of impersonal God. But at least to begin with, it probably leads to confusion. I still remember when I actually listened to this aspect that Vishnu and Shiva are the representations or symbolic representation of impersonal God, I went home and talked to my mom and said the first thing was like, you know what, Vishnu and Shiva are not real. They are symbolic representations of impersonal God. She was horrified, at least. That's what I think. I shouldn't have said those words. Obviously, I told without any proper understanding, but that's what the message I carried over, at least. So I'm assuming that maybe other people too. But the initial stages, we need to be a little more careful of what we read and listen to. Maybe once we attain some kind of maturity, probably it's all fine then. And just to give that, nothing is lost, Sri Krishna says in the Gita, whatever deity or form a devotee worships, I make his or her faith steady. However, their wishes are only granted by me alone. So really, whatever anthropomorphic image, whether Vishnu, Shiva, or incarnation, or anything else that you follow, it doesn't matter. As long as one is sincere in their devotion, God is there to take care of that person. So really, it should not be a big worry. The practice number 6 is chanting a mantra. Here the mantra could be a name of God, or it could be a syllable, or it could be a sentence. A meditation technique to help focusing on God. This is technically called japa. And when perfected, a state is reached where the mantra runs automatically in the background. This is what many great saints have said and done too. So once we then there's no need for any conscious efforts to be put to chant the mantra. It runs continuously. The examples are, of course, there's various traditions have these methods prescribed: Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Sufism, and so on. Also, Sri Sarda Devi used to chant thousands of times a day, probably continuously all the time. So she'll be a good ideal if you want to really practice this mantra in this particular practice. And then also there's a book called Way of a Pilgrim. Most of you probably know it. There the mendicant practices the prayer of Jesus continuously, and his life gets transformed. So definitely there are more examples. Practice 7 is the meditation on the form of God. Here, to intensify the visualization of God, we need to practice this, especially if we have a personal God with form. This is much more important, of course. The form that God would manifest to the devotee is what you visualize to begin with. So once we intensify that visualization, it may change into a reality eventually. The form must appear to be living. Of course, initially it may not be, but eventually it should go to that state. That's the goal of this practice. We have to see that form as a living reality. Sri Ramakrishna said to Swami Vivekananda when he was asked, did you see God? He said, well, I saw God, and I see him much more clearly than I see you. So that means whatever the physical perceptions that we have now, they should appear to be less real than the entity that we are visualizing. That's a very, I would say, a tall call for us probably, but we need to strive for that. The form may be partial to begin with that you visualize. You may visualize face, maybe feet or hands and so on. But once it gets stabilized and matured, the entirety of form will appear. Again, that will be spontaneous, not that someone has to really try for it, but it will mature to that. That's what at least has been told. Practice number 8 is meditation on the deeds of God. Here, God's deeds, of course, are called Leela, and this will also help us to intensify the feeling that the God is a living entity. Because a form would probably give us some kind of a static image, I would say, but the deeds make it much more lively. It's like as though the person is a living person because of the actions that he or she has done. So it's a beneficial substitute for the useless gossips that we indulge in, because we could be more curious about the deeds of God rather than deeds of others. And also, the affairs of the world, like what's happening there and here and so on. So we need to strive to come out of that curiosity mongering about, knowing things of the world, maybe more curious to know what God has done as his sport on his earth or as Leela. As I said, this makes God much more lively. The practice number 9 is a constant remembrance. This is the utmost one, I would say, for our daily practices. We have to remember God as much as we can in every moment of life. Sri Ramakrishna said something on this respect. I tell you the truth, there is nothing wrong in your being in the world, but you must direct your mind towards God. Otherwise, you will not succeed. Do your duty with one hand and with the other hold to God. After the duty is over, you will hold to God with both hands. So that means, of course, you're never leaving God. That's the idea. So having seen that, this is the last subtopic, I would say, of my talk. It's the stages of devotion. So we will see what kind of stages a devotee passes through in his or her life. Here I borrowed a quote from Sri Ramakrishna. Nishtha leads to bhakti. Bhakti, when mature, becomes bhava. Bhava, when concentrated, becomes Mahabhava. And last of all is prema. Prema is like a cord. By prema, God is bound to the devotee. He can no longer run away. An ordinary man can at best achieve bhava. That is the third stage. None but an Ishvara Koti attains Mahabhava and prema. I will somewhat touch upon these terminologies later on now. The first stage is, of course, nishtha, which means steadfastness. Here, the characteristic in this stage is there is no strong or intense love for God. This is the beginning stages. But we need to face the world. And most of the times, there are so many obstacles in the devotional path. So we need some kind of aid here to have that, to inculcate devotion for God. And of course, since we don't have strong love for God, obviously that's not going to help us either. So here, I would say reasoning comes to us, comes to a good help. So we need to reason out why we need to have devotion. That's the beginning stages. If we don't have proper reasoning why we need devotion, I would say it's probably difficult, unless someone gets intense love, at a much more rapid pace. But initially, it's much more difficult. So we need to reason it out and then stick to devotional path as much as we can. So the reasoning needs to be guided. And so for the tender plant of bhakti, here, jnana becomes the fence. The fence is necessary when the tree is young. This is a quote from Sri Ramakrishna. But it can be taken away when the trunk is thick and strong. Then the tree won't be hurt, even if an elephant is tied to it. So jnana acts as a fence to the tender plant of bhakti, which didn't blossom completely yet. So I picked up some kind of obstacles that we usually face in this stage. The first one is obviously questions and doubts raised about the efficacy of bhakti. These questions and doubts, of course, raised within oneself too, but also not only from within oneself. People also ask questions, and if you are in a group of people who don't share these ideals, then of course you will be looked as something weird. So we need to be convinced that whatever we are doing is something right. So again, here we need to reason it out well. So the solution is happiness is the goal of life, whatever be the case. If you want to be a devotee or a philosopher like a jnani or even an atheist, I think everyone wants to be happy. So that's the goal of life. And it is available in abundance in bhakti. That's actually the cornerstone of bhakti is the bliss, ananda aspect. And again, the testimony to this fact is we have seen a lot of devotees and saints of the temperament who are very blissful. So that should be a good enough for us to motivate and think that there's abundance of happiness in the bhakti. And again, the question is the visualization that you begin with, the imagination of personal God at this stage. Is it real? Is it logical? Well, it may not be real or logical at that point, but the point is it will reach to the goal. That's the point. So whether it's real or illogical at that point is irrelevant. We really should not get bothered by that. And again, if you want to have some proof, you cannot have the proof at the intellect level or at the perception of senses, at least in this stage. So what we will have to see is the transformation that the psyche undergoes. So if a person gets transformed after doing some certain spiritual practices of devotional kind, that should be a good enough proof. The obstacle number 2 is fanaticism. Most of us, or many, maybe some of us rather, maybe, I don't know, we do fall prey to this kind of attitude. We think whatever we are doing is right, and not only that, that's fine if it is only stops that up to that point, but then we think everyone else also should do the same. So that's where the problem comes. So we need to avoid that kind of fanatic attitude, and the solution here is, I'll just present a quote from Swami Vivekananda in this respect. The proof of one religion depends on the proof of all the rest. For instance, if I have 6 fingers and no one else has, you may well say that is abnormal. The same reasoning may be applied to the argument that only one religion is true and all others false. One religion only, like one set of 6 fingers in the world, would be unnatural. We see, therefore, that if one religion is true, all others must be true. There are differences in non-essentials, but in essentials, they are all one. Moving on to the next obstacle, it's the worldly attractions. At this stage, obviously, there's no intense love for God, but there is still some attraction for, say, human relations, material objects, and so on. We need to get over that too. And the one way is, again, properly guiding our reasoning aspect, and we have to again use the Jnana aspect here, where we think God is the real being. If you don't want to use the word real, you can think God is the only important entity, and everyone else is not so important. We can begin with that. And the obstacle number 4 is difficulties in life. Again, in this stage, when the intense love for God is not yet generated, whenever we face some difficulties, the idea comes like, what, God is not taking care of me, what's the point? That's a common thing many people do face. And the solution is, first we need to see that opportunities, these are the difficulties that we face in life are actually the opportunities for growth, for our devotional growth. We mostly learn only in difficulties, so that's mostly true. So that's why they are good opportunities for our growth. Before I go further, actually, I wanted to put illustration here. Kunti Devi, the mother of Pandavas in Mahabharata, she used to pray to Krishna saying, please give us more difficulties, because in difficulties we will remember you. Otherwise, we tend to forget. So that's one aspect where we definitely have to think of, whenever we are in difficulties, we do definitely think of God. And also, if we carefully observe, most of the pain that we get during these difficulties are because the attachments are being removed from our life. So that's the pain that we feel. So in a way, it is helping our growth. Only thing, we have to see it in a proper light. Again, there's an illustration here too. Sri Krishna and Arjuna visited a poor old woman, and who had only cow for her subsistence. She served them well, everything, and Sri Krishna then blessed her, saying, let your cow die. Of course, it's a bit horrifying, I guess. Arjuna obviously was horrified, but Sri Krishna told Arjuna that now she will rely only on God and no one else. So we need to get to that stage too, obviously. Again, in what I have seen, at least from my limited understanding, that God is very compassionate enough to grant only sufficient misery that we can withstand. He or she doesn't give miseries that throw us off completely, I would say. Because these are like blessings to us in a way, whatever difficulties that we are getting, if you see it that way. And those are the much needed impetus for us to take the next step in our devotional journey. And lastly, we should have this faith that whatever is happening, whether it's good or bad, pleasurable or painful, is good for me. That's is beneficial for me, rather, is for our growth. That's the underlying faith. And for this, Sri Krishna himself has assured us in the Gita that he is taking care of the devotees, that God is taking care of the devotees. So we should really not have any worry with whatever is happening to us. Going to stage 2, Bhakti, that means devotion. And here the characteristic is, now that we are convinced in stage 1, like we need to love God, we probably can overcome those obstacles there. But here the characteristic would be, the strength would be how to cultivate the strength here would be how to love God. That's the point here. And again, the method prescribed is constant remembrance. Besides the methods that we talked about earlier, the 9 practices and also the 5 emotional devotional moods, bhava. So we should employ all that properly to generate that love for God. Obstacle is, of course, not remembering God always. I used to frequent one organization before coming here in India. There, the motto was, we have to remember God always. And their philosophy or their explanation for that was, the method was rather, is constant remembrance. And they say it will work because whomever you love, you will think of them always. In the same way, the reverse is true. If you begin to think of someone always, you will start loving. So this has been prescribed even in Gita. Actually, in Gita, the 2nd chapter, it says, if a man or woman who dwells his or her thoughts continuously on material objects, which could be human relations too, they develop attachment towards that. So if it's true for any material object, it must be true for God too, of course. So we need to constantly remember to generate love for God. And the other method prescribed is to do those devotional practices few times a day. Most of us probably practice during the daytime and evening time, like meditation or singing songs or even doing worship and so on. But what we do with the rest of the day is, of course, important. And I would say much more because, first of all, there's more time and spent in that hiatus between morning and evening. Besides that, whatever you do during that time will get carried over to your regular practices of morning and evening. So we need to pay more attention to what we do during the daytime. And one of the practices that I like is the Islam practice where they do 5 times prayer a day, which is very important because whatever you do those 5 times, your attitude gets carried over to the rest of the day and you're always at least more likely to dwell on God. And also, whenever you're doing some non-focused work, we can keep chanting the name of God in the background, like, say, plowing the snow, as in these days, or mowing the lawn, or running in gym, and so on. Once that gets matured, then we will be able to focus even doing or we'll be able to chant the name of God even when we need to focus on some kind of work that needs full attention, say looking into accounts or your regular office job. And the stage 3 is bhava, which means yearning. Here, the characteristic is love towards God becomes more spontaneous. It's somewhat a bit higher than the stage 2. So here, conscious efforts may not be needed, but the love is not so intense that everything else drops off. So we still need to be careful and continue doing our practices. It's the same thing. Obstacle, of course, is not doing the practices. I would say the solution is to just remember whatever struggles that we have undergone in the earlier stages, if you reach this stage, and also to see other people's lives and how they are struggling. That's probably the lesson that we can learn. Stage 4 is Mahabhava. As Sri Ramakrishna said earlier, Ishwar Kotis only reach stage 4 and 5. So we don't have to be disheartened, but at least we can try to achieve as much as we can. Characteristic is they cannot live without God at that point. That's period. I mean, they don't want to do anything else with the world. They just cannot live without God. And here the method is, of course, no method. It's just intense yearning. There's really no method prescribed for at this stage. And the solution, obstacle, I guess there's nothing either, because it's just that you have to patiently wait for God. This is more like a waiting stage where you wait for God's vision to come or God to manifest. So we have seen a lot of devotional poems of this kind from great sages, all their pangs of love for vision of God and so on. So this is the stage where they reached, and they have composed very, I would say, very strong and very deep emotional poems, devotional poems rather. And the solution is, I just put some solution, maybe it's not even right, but it's patience, it's all God's will. So whenever he or she chooses to manifest, it'll happen. That's probably it. And the stage 5, that was called prema in the Sri Ramakrishna's code, it's love. It's actually not really a stage, it's a goal. The devotee becomes love. There's nothing else. The characteristic is, of course, there's no distinction between God and love, God and devotee here. He or she is just pure love. The goal has been reached at this stage. To end my talk, I will just present a quote from Swami Vivekananda on this particular goal or stage. What happened? I lost it. I'll read from here. Swami Vivekananda. When the heart is purified and cleansed and filled to the brim with the divine nectar of love, all other ideas of God become simply puerile and are rejected as being inadequate or unworthy. Such is indeed the power of Parabhakti or supreme love. And the perfected Bhakta no more goes to see God in temples and churches. He knows no place where he will not find him. He finds him in the temple as well as out of the temple. He finds him in the saint's saintliness as well as in the wicked man's wickedness, because he has him already seated in the glory in his own heart as the one almighty, inextinguishable light of love, which is ever shining and eternally present. There ends my talk. Thank you. Sri Gurubhyo Namaha. Salutations to all Gurus. Thank you.